Welcome, everyone. My name is Harold Trinkunis. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Welcome to our weekly research seminar. This is the first meeting of the winter quarter, and thank you for joining us. We'll be hearing today from Dr. Andrea Bartoletti on his work on escaping the deadly embrace, encirclement at the origins of World War I. Dr. Bartoletti received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and his research focuses on international security, IR theory, particularly interested in the origins of major wars, U.S. grand strategy, and great power interactions and competition. So without much further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bartoletti. Just as a reminder, enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can enter them at any time during Dr. Bartoletti's talk, and I will return to moderate the Q&A at the conclusion of the talk. Hopefully we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you had a nice break. Just before I start the presentation, just to give you like a little bit of framework, this is supposed to be a spin-off article on my book manuscript, which is on the origins of major wars. And as for potential outlet that I'm looking for is international security, security studies. So any kind of comment you have, of course, on the paper is gladly like welcomed. But if you have like more comments on my research, I can expand on my book manuscript in the Q&A. So let's start with summary. So I'm going to briefly address the topic whether it is still like appropriate to talk about great power wars after the end of the Cold War. And I'm going to address briefly the literature and part of the literature at least and its shortcomings according to me. Then I'm going to elaborate on my theory. I'm going to see its application, the empirical evidence on the major case study of my work, which is World War I, and then moving to see some implications of my work. Now, there has been a lot of literature after the end of the Cold War making the case that great power war, and in particular like systemic war, which are the ones that I'm addressing, are obsolete, anachronistic. And there's been like a lot of like explanations from the increasing cost of war, the impact of nuclear weapons, growing economic independence, and the lack of legitimacy of aggression. But at the same time, has been growing discussion among scholars, and in particular like public policy, about the reemergence of great power politics. And the main focus of these interests has been in the potential clash between the United States and China. And not just security competition, but like even war. Think about like early zone like disease threat. But the existing literature has been the new focus on like the conflict between U.S. and China has been framed through existing literature, which I think has some fundamental problems. And indeed, while I'm thinking like focusing on China is important for understanding the future dynamics of potential global wars, I think like the focus on U.S.-China rivalry is not the appropriate one or the main one. Now, there's been like countless explanations for war, but like not many explanations for great major wars, like systemic wars. Most of like the explanations, think about the bargaining model of war, explain just one step. In that case, war initiation. But it has been like not many theories which are really overarching comprehensive theories that try to explain all the steps that lead through security competition up to the involvement of all the great powers in a systemic war. I think that the most compelling, even though I don't agree with them, theories are more like power transition theories, and I use Copeland as the most elegant form of it. And then like what I call dominant theories. So the idea like for Mearsheimer that like a state tries to become the only great power in a certain region to dominate the system. They both agree like on the same element. the most powerful state in the system tries to remain or to become the hegemon, the only great power in the system. They disagree on when it will lead, it will bid for hegemony, or will like try to remain an hegemon. Like for offensive realists would be when the most powerful state is on the rise. For power transition theorists, coupling would be when it's on decline, the inevitable decline. I think there are like several problems with this. I can go more on the Q&A. Most importantly, if you look at the list of major wars from in modern history from 1494, at least half of them has been not initiated by the most powerful state in the system. And there's been like several cases where existing hegemonic theories will predict war and we are not seeing it. Just to relate to the case study of my paper, Mearsheimer agrees, like acknowledges in his book that Imperial Germany should have launched a bid for hegemony in 1904-5 during the Russo-Japanese War. But every case of crisis after 1903 is an anomaly for hegemonic theories a la Mearsheimer. But also, like, think about Copeland. So Copeland cannot explain why the declining hegemon at the turn of the 19th century, Great Britain, did not launch a preventive war against the rising challenger Imperial Germany. Why? Well, like, he thinks that like his theory works for the case between Germany and Russia. And another couple like small problems. They think that not just the initiation of the war, but also the contagion of the war works through like a simple mechanism. There is one against all the rest. So the most powerful state will lead to a counter-hegemonic balancing coalition. And then, as I mentioned, like some of these comprehensive theories still lack an explanation for some part of it. Now, with that said, I tried to address these problems by engendering a new theory on the origins of major wars. Briefly, I think that major wars are caused by the attempt of a great power to escape its encirclement, which is the possibility of being simultaneously attacked on two different fronts. And in addition to this, I include an intervening variable, which I call the invasion ability or the immediate rival, to explain the dynamic like element of initiation and contagion. So major wars unfold from encirclement to 3 steps: double security dilemma, war initiation, and war contagion. Before I unpack a little bit more the theory, just a few definitions to be on the same page. So major war, I define major wars as overt and direct military confrontations among all the great powers in the region. They threaten in this way the survival of all great powers, and I exclude from all these no corporate intervention or proxy wars, even if they involve all great powers. Just to give an idea, the Korean War could not be listed as a major war for this reason. Encirclement. Encirclement is a geographic variable. It's basically a great power, not just any other great power. A great power, what I call the encircled great power, has 2 different great powers, which I call surrounding great powers, on 2 different borders. There can be 2 situations. The classic one, where 2 different great powers on 2 different borders, and then when one great power, one surrounding great power, shares 2 different borders with the encircled, with the one in the middle. So with some images to give a better idea, the first type, think about like World War I. From 1871, Germany was encircled by France on the west and Russia on the east, 2 other great powers. And this is the case of the second type, the kind of wars Charles V, like at the turn of the 16th century, where you see like all these gray areas are part of the Habsburg Empire, a single great power encircling the Kingdom of France. So you see the Kingdom of Spain, Netherlands, which at the time were called Spanish Netherlands, the French Comté on the east, were all part of the Habsburg possession by one single great power. Now, in the paper, I mentioned that this is called latent encirclement. So latent encirclement is a synonym for geographic encirclement in my paper, but it's different word from what I call actualized encirclement. And here, it's important for the second step of the explanation, and it's the invasion ability or the immediate rival. So the immediate rival is the state that poses the greatest threat to of invasion, and it's a combination of like power, of course, but also geography. the ability of launching like an attack and invading. And when there is a change in the threat environment, a change in the stability of your main opponent to launch a successful attack, then there's going to be a change in invasion ability of the immediate rival. Just to be clear, for the encircled great power, the immediate rivals are the surrounding great powers, the two of the different borders. And I'm going to explain like a little bit later when there is the point of no return where we move from latent encirclement, which is geographic, and actualized encirclement, which is the result of this operational capability by the flank states. Now, latent encirclement. So when we have encirclement, so this geographic situation, this geographic variable, you have two great powers in the first type at two different borders. This situation engenders the first step towards major wars, which are called double security dilemma. So the main difference from the typical security dilemma that we all know, or like we can elaborate more later in case, is that the encircled great power has an incredibly dangerous situation because it has to confront not just one but two great powers and has to like double the effort to escape its situation. So all the problems related to the security dilemma are incredibly heightened for the encircled great power, which will try aggressively to escape its encirclement. And mostly it would be through two steps. One is forming alliances. So, and this will become clear like in the third step, but the idea is to have like potential allies that will divert the attention and the resources and a potential attack by the surrounding great powers. And the second main option is creating buffer zones. And it would be a buffer zone between the encircled great power and the surrounding great power, by creating a wedge between the two surrounding great powers by not allowing them to unite their forces. But like these measures that the encircled great power creates engenders like similar countermeasures by the surrounding great powers, by in this way creating the typical spiral of the security dilemma. Now, this security dilemma, like, is in a certain sense not constant, but like it lasts for several decades usually. So, but it's not dynamic enough to explain why the encircled great power decides to initiate an attack against one of the surrounding great powers. And here, when it's like what I call actualized encirclement comes in. So there is a point of no return, before which the encircled great power launches the war. And it's basically when one of the surrounding great powers can increase its operational ability to launch a two-front war. Basically, the surrounding great powers do not always have the ability to launch a two-front wars, because usually they have like internal or external security threats that can divert their attention, or they have like internal problems like that can stall like their ability like to form a coordinating plan with the other surrounding great power. When these hurdles like are no longer present, they can coerce or even attack on two different fronts in the encircled great power. In order to prevent that, as a measure of last resort, the encircled great power launches an attack, which lead to the third step to a cascade of military interventions by all the other great powers. And this is for the same mechanism. Basically, the other great powers are dragged into the war for preventing their respective immediate rival from increasing their invasion ability. So the ability, their operational capacity to launch an invasion. Now, just a couple of clarifications. The immediate rival of all the other great powers is not necessarily the same of the encircled great power or the surrounding great powers. What happens during the first step, actually, is that the necessity of the encircled great power to find allies to counter its immediate rival, which are the surrounding great powers. So this necessity creates a checkerboard system in which the encircled great power tries to find allies against the surrounding great powers, and this in turn will lead the surrounding great powers to form an alliance between them and to find allies to check the other alliance that was formed in the first place. In this way, we find two blocks which are centered with one leader, the encircled great power, and the other leader, one of the surrounding great powers. And all of the great powers coalesce among these two main great powers. And when a war initiates, that leads to a cascade of military interventions. Now, to move to the case study that I addressed in the paper, World War I, there are like numbers, countless number of theories. I list what I call like the main thesis, like the Fisher thesis, structural hegemonic theories, which are Mearsheimer and Copeland, for instance, which are different from Fisher thesis. For those who don't know, Fisher thesis still is within the idea that Germany tried to become the dominant power in Europe. The main difference is not structure; it's based on domestic politics. But like the outcome is the same. They expect Germany to try to force a continental war to become the only great power in Europe. Then the third explanation, which I think the most compelling, even though is only partial, is World War I was the result of a failed strategy of calculated risk. And lastly, the invented war thesis, the fact that like politicians like enter into the war because of like the mechanism of mobilization, which they could not have no longer control. Now, my explanation for World War I is that Germany was encircled by France and Russia since its unification in 1871. That led to the double security dilemma and the necessity of Germany to try to escape it by using like creating a network of alliances and splitting like rival alliances before the initiation of the war, which was the result of the ability of its immediate rival, Russia, to increase its capacity to launch a two-front war with France. And these started to form after the end of the Balkan Wars in 1913, and when Russia ramped up the construction of strategic railroads in Poland. When Germany launched declared war on Russia and then France, the other great powers were dragged into the conflict because of the rival-based network of alliances that was formed and that was initiated by the German attempt to escape its encirclement in the decades that preceded like the July crisis. Sorry. So to unpack a little bit more the three steps that led to World War I, Germany is the encircled great power, tried to prevent France and Russia, the surrounding great powers, from becoming capable of launching a two-front war. Russia and France were not in the condition of doing all that because they had either internal or external conditions that prevented them from concentrating their forces against Germany. And the attempts of first Bismarck and then the Kaiser Wilhelm to prevent this is first to isolate France from Russia. When that fails between 1892 and 1894, the alliance between France and Russia is formed. The next step is to strengthen the alliance with Austria-Hungary to counter Russia, and most importantly, to try to split the alliance first between France and Russia, and when Great Britain joins, to split the Triple Entente. And this is mostly done, in particular, like in the last decade before the initiation of the war, through the initiation of a series of crises, which are basically like coercive diplomacy, a strategy of calculated risk to force the opponents to defect from the alliance without triggering a continental war. As an explanation for this, I just briefly like put this quote from Bismarck that nicely like counters explanations like the one of Mearsheimer. As I mentioned, like people that think that Germany tried to become the hegemon in those years cannot address why Germany did not take advantage of several crises to escalate local conflicts to a continental war. And one of the cases is the period of the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 and 1905, in which Russia was in disarray. That was the best time for Germany to attack France because Russia could not come to the help of its ally. Quite the contrary, Germany tries to form a treaty with Russia to isolate France again, like it did during Bismarck in the 1890s. And this is called the Treaty of Björkö. And it was signed on a ship, on a cruise between the Kaiser and the Tsar. And after the signature of this treaty, the Kaiser said, "My eyes were brimming with tears of happiness. The Treaty of Björkö has become a turning point in the history of Europe, thanks to the grace of God, and a great relief for my dear fatherland, which at least be freed from the dreadful clutch of the Gallo-Russian pincers." So the idea is that it's not to try to become the dominant state, it's trying to break the encirclement through splitting hostile alliances. Eventually, the Tsar cannot go through because Sazonov, the foreign ministry of Russia, and Dmitry prevents the ratification of the treaty. But this gives an idea that Germany had limited aims during those years. And in particular, during the Balkan Wars, it had the Balkan Wars are in particular interesting because they are similar dynamics of what happened during the July crisis. Germany adopted a strategy of calculated risk, coercive diplomacy, and it is to try to split the Triple Entente without triggering a continental war. There is the hope, the willingness to have territorial gains against Russia in the south, in particular, by isolating Serbia through Austria-Hungary without escalating the war. And the reason why there is no escalation of the war during the Balkan Wars, which are really similar to the July crisis and the July crisis, is that after the Balkan Wars, which were a staggering diplomatic victory for Germany and Austria-Hungary, France pushes extremely hard to Russia, to its ally, to ramp up its strategic railroads. And Russia, which was really backward from 1905 till 1911, 1912, after the defeat suffered against Japan, start ramping up its construction. And this will lead to what I call Eastern Prussia. So Poland, which is at the border with Eastern Prussia, which at the time was part of Germany. So the idea is that it will tear apart all those days, this is called 6 weeks of mobilization between the Russian declaration of war, mobilization, and the actual ability to go to the German border. So this would prevent the implementation of the Schlieffen Plan. So the ability to attack France before a two-front war has to be gauged against France and Russia. So since Russia ramps up the construction of strategic railroads and will lead to this operational capacity to launch a two-front attack with France, at that point, there is a point of no return. Then the July crisis is initiated, and it is initiated through an attempt of fait accompli by trying to crush Serbia through Austria-Hungary without the involvement of all the other powers like the Balkan crisis. And when that failed, only where Russia mobilized, then Germany is compelled to declare war. And just to give an idea of how the strategic railroads of Poland were key for this decision by the Chancellor and the Kaiser to initiate war, I just put this quote from the Chancellor after the cold blank check during the July crisis with Austria-Hungary. So Anglo-Russian negotiations for a naval agreement and a landing Pomerania as the last link in a chain. Russia's quickly growing its minority might. After the completion of the strategic railroads in Poland, our position will be untenable. So Austria increasingly undermined from north and southeast, at any rate incapable of going to war for German interests as our ally, the Entente knows that we are therefore completely paralyzed. So that's to consider as a war as a measure of last resort, not an attempt to bid for hegemony. And the idea is that, just feel the last slide, so the other great powers were then dragged in because the existing rival-based network of alliances. So just to quickly conclude, because I'm running out of time, what are the implications of my work, of my theory, and the evidence from World War I for the future? So major wars are not caused by a state trying to beat or to remain a regional hegemon. They are caused by a state that faces encirclement, a geographic variable, the presence of two great powers on two different borders. Independently from its power, it can be the most powerful state, can be weaker than its surrounding great powers, that doesn't really matter. We see like a constant like occurrence relatively like from these variables. But like the main thing is that the encircled great power initiates a war for the limited goal of preventing actualized encirclement. Not for being for hegemony, for the absolute gain of becoming or remaining like the hegemon. Now, moving like to the implications, like which next measure will we expect to see? It's not going to be like the next decade. It's not like a prediction in point of time, but in terms of dynamics. So there is a lot of debate about and a lot of talk about like the rivalry between the United States and China. And while I think that they will play an important role, I think that the focus is misleading. China is the major problem, not because it will try to become the hegemon, not because the United States will win the line and launch a preventive war to prevent the rise of China. I think the main problem is territorial. The main problem is geographic. The main problem is that China will be encircled by India and Russia, as I predict India to become a great power, until like mentioned the importance of the United States, through the increasing help that it has from the United States, from the economic and security realm. I predict India to become a great power. And when that happens, China will be encircled by India and Russia. And that will trigger the double security dilemma that we saw, for instance, for Germany with France, Russia before World War I. And that will escalate the crisis when they will be able to launch a two-front war. Of course, there will be like a lot of like elements that might prevent that, but there is also a lot of like focal points that will increase the chances. So think, for instance, about like the increasing like rivalry that is going on, even though we are not already like in the system of my theory, there is an intensive rivalry between India and China over like what are called the string of pearls, like all the commercial military bases that China is being like along the Indian Ocean. There is growing concern about like the alignment of Pakistan with China, which by the way, India considers as a potential like two-front war problem as well. And there is like growing concern about like ongoing dispute through decades actually between China and India, and in particular like in the region of Kashmir. And recently there has been like in the past months an increasing like number of skirmishes between China and India of the region of Xinjiang, which is like near the region of Xinjiang of China, which is also a delicate region for the internal like stability of the regime of Beijing. So to conclude, I think that encirclement is in particular like a state that has two great powers on its border. The territorial problem that creates is should be the focus of our attention in Asia. I think the United States might play a role as an ally in the case, for instance, of India, but it would not be the main dyad that we need to focus on. According to me, it should be the one between China and India, with also an eye with the behavior of Russia. With that said, I'm looking forward to your questions, and if you want me to elaborate on any part of this or my book manuscript, I'm happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bartoletti. And just as a reminder to everybody, please go ahead and enter your questions or comments in the Q&A section of Zoom. So I'll start out with a question from Perry Bloom, to which which I'll elaborate a little bit. It's, yes, given the importance of geography in your presentation, is a lesser great power like India incapable of being encircled? For example, in India versus China confrontation, of course, you just touched on that, but maybe you could expand that to think about sort of what are the great powers that are candidates that you would be looking at for your theory to apply. So besides Germany, how far down the list? Is it 1 through 5, 1 through 10? Maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
And just to be clear, like if I don't misunderstand the question, this is about the future possibility, right? So not about past. So, yeah. So just like to clarify something, maybe like with the definition it didn't come through well. In order to be encircled, you must be a great power, and you must be surrounded by other great powers. So an example that I always give: the United States is not encircled by Canada and Mexico, because the United States is a great power, but Canada and Mexico are not. So in order to have this dynamic that will lead to major wars, you need like these two criteria. Now, in terms of like the concerns for the future, definitely like China will be the major concern for the reasons I just mentioned. One can like see India as a potential encircled great power, but you need to bet on the rise of Pakistan, which I think will not be like very likely in terms of economic like growth over the next decades in order to create that problem for India. That doesn't mean that India will not see that as a two-front war problem. You can have a two-front war problem even if you are like a minor power, or so if you have two states can attack you, you have a two-front war problem. But it will not trigger like all the mechanisms that I explained. Another situation that will create, and actually there is a lot of like rhetoric by Russia. Of course, it's by Russia, so we need to take that with a grain of salt. And like, of course, it's skewed on their behalf. But like Russia fears encirclement by NATO expansion. And definitely you can see if NATO could go to the borders of Russia, Russia will face a two-front war problem by NATO on its west side and by China on its southeast side.
Great. Now for a question from Gilly Vardy at Stanford History Department. Says, thank you for a fascinating, thought-provoking seminar. She says, it seems to me that most major actors in the international system do not suffer from the strategic threat of encirclement. This is a uniquely German problem, Germany being a Central European power. Almost by definition, a great power cannot actually be encircled. We simply don't have enough great powers geographically close enough to make such threats or powerful enough to be considered great powers. Fear of encirclement is a German obsession with very little actual good reasons for it, other than German-centered ones. Perhaps this German problem is not easily generalizable to factors such as size, geography, and geopolitics. Encirclement has meaning only if we're looking at rivals which can perform an enveloping or double enveloping maneuvers. Then she adds, the only other actors which face this exact question in Europe and the Middle East are Poland and Israel. Hardly great powers.
Definitely, like, so I've been pushed on expanding this beyond great powers. I think it would be another paper for sure, maybe an extension of my book manuscript. And of course, like the fear of encirclement by Israel, for instance, is one that one can look upon. Like I mentioned, Pakistan would be another one. The idea of strategic depth against India during the war in Afghanistan is within like the extension of my theory. But like for this paper, I think it goes beyond. As for the rarity, yeah, major wars like don't happen every day. They happen like 10 times according to like the most like renowned like classifications. Think about Levy from 1494 until now, and they were all encircled with power except one case, which is World War II. Now the Germany can explain the anomaly if you want to. But yes, that the fact that it is uncommon doesn't mean that we should not study it. Great powers are present. There's been more than one great power several times in history. So we are a little bit skewed by the fact that we still believe that we are unipolarity, but after the end like of the Cold War. But like there were like several cases of encircled great powers throughout the centuries in Europe where there were 3, 4, 5 more great powers. Of course, Germany, which is, and I want to make a small clarification of this, the German fear of encirclement is different from my theory. Because like sometimes people like Jack Snyder, for instance, talks about that. That's a psychological explanation, which I disagree upon, but like just to be clear, like that's a different explanation. That's based on like either domestic politics or like the role of leaders in terms of like, this myth, these biases that they have that will lead to irrational behavior. I think this is purely structural. And then, of course, like Germany is not the only case. France has been encircled more than Germany throughout history. Prussia is another case. One can make the case of like the Soviet Union after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So Germany is certainly like one of the cases, but like it's not the only one. And I can expand more on the other ones that we saw through modern history if someone wants to.
Thanks. The next question is from Jill Hazelton at the Naval War College. She says, wonderful project. I have several questions. On theory, there seems to be some conceptual slippage among major war, systemic war, a war threatening survival of all great powers. Can you clarify?
Sure. Sorry.
I'll just read there's like three of them. Research design. Can you identify your universe and domain of cases? In this context, does a war with China really threaten the survival of all great powers? Did the Habsburg War really threaten the survival of all great powers? And then, why don't you go ahead and address those two first, and then I'll come back to the last point.
Sure. So, can you repeat it? Sorry.
The first one is difference between. So you use
major war, systemic war,
war threatening. Can you clarify the differences?
Yeah. So, like the thing is that in the literature, there has been like a lot of confusion. People use mostly different terms for talking about the same thing. I use major war because the main foil on my work is Copeland, which uses the same one. We can call it systemic wars, like, but in terms of like criteria, it must involve all the great powers in the region, and it must, and in that case, it threatens all the survival, and it threatens the survival because each great power fears that its immediate rival will gain relative power from it, will gain an operational capacity to launch an invasion. So all the criteria that I need for my theory, like to list a war among great powers as a major war, is that it involves all of them in a region. And then like it doesn't matter like the lethality, because there is growing literature like showing the role of medicine, like the mind skill, like all this. If involves all the great power, it's a major war. In terms of universal cases, if you have the paper in front of you, it's page 16. I address all the modern history based on like Leibniz classification from 1494. In my book manuscript, I'm thinking about like moving beyond that, but it depends on like the kind of review that I will get in the coming weeks. But like in modern history, the Italian Wars, 1494, 1559, 30 Years War, Franco-Dutch War, 9 Years War, War of the Spanish Succession, and War of the Austrian Succession. So the last war I usually call like the Louis XIV War, but there are 4 different major wars launched by France, which was in encircled power at the time. Then there is the War of the Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years War involved Prussia as the encircled power during the 18th century. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, I consider them as only one. Some authors consider them separate, but it's a case of like where France was encircled, then of course World War I and World War II, in which in the first case Germany was encircled. The second one, I think it's the main anomaly of my study. But like those are the 10 major wars in modern history. I don't know if I addressed all of them.
I think I'm going to give Dr. Hazelton a chance to ask another question a little bit later. So let's move on to Scott Sagan from Stanford Political Science. He says, can you explain the point in the slide about no uncertainty about British neutrality? That seems problematic for you, both theoretically, parentheses, if the UK was already committed to a war against Germany, then Germany was effectively encircled much earlier than 1914, and empirically, because Bethmann made many comments to the Kaiser about the possibility, not the certainty, of British intervention.
I dare to disagree with that. I think there is enough evidence, and like not just by you look at archives, like several historians, like from Trachtenberg and so on, till like during the revival on the centenary, like of the outbreak of the war, making the case like also Copeland, by the way, makes the case since my thought that like Germany knew that if they attacked Russia or France, in particular France, they will trigger like the British involvement. I'm saying perhaps the slide is a bit confusing in terminology. I didn't think that Great Britain wanted to attack Germany, but German officials knew that if they attack France, Great Britain will step in, because there are like attempted explanations that make the case of like Germany tried to have a continental war without involvement of Great Britain. So there was some miscalculation because of that, because they weren't sure whether Great Britain would actually step in. Otherwise, they would not go through. I think that the evidence is clear on that. I don't know if I make the case compellingly enough in my paper on the explanation, but I think I have that view. And in terms of like British, and I'd just like to give an idea. I put like in the paper, I think also the telegram on August 1st, there is misleading, like an erroneous telegram in which it looked like that Great Britain told German officials and then led to the information to the Kaiser that if they kept the war on the east against Russia, they would not get involved. And the Kaiser was incredibly happy because it could contain the war on the east without involvement of Great Britain for sure, and then even France. That led to actually like there was like a misinterpretation of mistranslation, and eventually that led to the major war. But the idea is that Germany tried to prevent the continental war and involvement of Britain all the time, but like when they attacked like Russia and France, they knew it was inevitable.
Thanks. So the next question, I'm actually going to combine a couple different questions that I think they're somewhat related because they have to do with the impact of technological evolution on your theory, which is very much focused on geography and land adjacency. So Charles Weiss asks, how do naval and air forces detract from your territorial view of encirclement? If the U.S. is positioned in the near and in the South China Sea, are we participating in encirclement? And relatedly, Gil Baram, a fellow at CSAC, asks about emerging technologies. How do you think emerging technologies such as space, cyber, etc., might affect your argument for future wars?
No, great, excellent question. I address them more in depth in my book manuscript and the conclusion. Of course, I might need to go a bit more on this paper, like due to space constraints. I'm seeing like what I can do like with a good level like of that. Just one clarification: you can technically be encircled if you are an insular power like Great Britain. I think it's highly unlikely because basically you need to block all the sea lane around the island, or like in order to have like that kind of encirclement. But you can definitely do that. And in the case, this is like from theoretical, in theoretical terms. Of course, then you get specific situations. So, but in terms of theory, you need like something simple, something that can travel across space and time. That's why I like add just those two types. But like going to this question about like the role of the U.S. presence and the Pacific region, definitely the U.S. could play a role. But yeah, I would say through South Korea, more than like, of course, like they're having like bases in Japan and having the ability to logistically to move troops quickly would be a role, would be play a major part. But the U.S. until the U.S. can invade China through territory, it would not be a surrounding great power. It can happen. So like if you, it can mass troops like in South Korea and take over North Korea and then move to China. But like until that happens, the US is not the main problem for China in terms of like territorial invasion. It can be, like I'm not excluding that. And in terms of like technology, as I mentioned before, I am addressing that more in the book manuscript, like the role of cybersecurity. I think it's all this debate like offense-defense balance, like the role of technology. I think it doesn't affect the mechanisms of my theory and the implications. It might change the way in which we might see a war. Of course, it wasn't mentioned in the question, like the impact of nuclear weapons will change the way we might see a war in case, for instance. But like, for instance, the role of cyber, in order for a cyber attack to be really like helpful, it must be done, according to me, in conjunction with a territorial invasion. So you need to shut down all the security system quickly in order to allow like a quick invasion, because if you don't do that, then you don't have enough relative gains if you want to, of course, initiate a war in terms of great power war. But in order to do that, you need to mobilize troops at the borders. In that case, that eliminates the surprise attack of a cyber attack. So what can be done, I think it's not going to be as likely as we might think. It would play a role in terms of security competition, but not much in terms of war initiation, which I think is the key thing that we want to look when we want to recognize whether a crisis will escalate or not.
Great. So I have a question here from Sig Hecker at CSAC. He says, interesting analysis. In addition to your projection of China possibly being encircled, what about Russia? It may feel encircled by NATO on one side and possibly by China, or a combination of U.S., Japan, South Korea on the other side. Russia has been quite clear about being willing to take actions to not be encircled: Georgia, Crimea, Donetsk.
Yeah, I agree. And I briefly mentioned that before. I agree, definitely. It's the second scenario I'm looking at. In terms of like, as I mentioned, like space is not enough already when I read like word limit in terms of like submission for a journal. So in case I might keep the China analogy for the implications for a paper, but like what you said about Russia net expansion is all present in my conclusion in the book chapter. It's something to analyze. Technically, I know that there is a lot of rhetoric, but like in terms of my theory, Russia is not encircled. If NATO, like if Ukraine became part of NATO, then there would be a problem. And one can definitely see, like, the Ukrainian crisis, the NATO Russia taking over Crimea, and all like the aggressiveness in the past years by Putin as a sign that he wants to prevent like a two-front war problem. So it definitely would play within my theory. But like as I mentioned, like I would predict like the China India rivalry as the most compelling case for the next one. But like hopefully the case. But yeah.
Let's go now to a note that Ethan Lee and Melissa Carlson and CSAC also asked some questions about technology. I might reframe those a little bit and come back to press you a little bit more on that. But let's go now to a question from Ali Alamari. And just to be clear, I'm trying to give everybody a chance to ask a question first before going back to people who've already asked questions. He says, thank you for your seminar, it's very informative. How does the theory of encirclement as a cause of major wars account for ideologies such as fascism, often advocating state expansion, and imperialism, instigating major wars, a distinction between ideological and geographical reasons for major war, or does encirclement include ideology as a lesser potential cause?
Good question to clarify. No, ideology doesn't play any role. My theory is purely structural. So it means that like what I call unit level variables don't play a role. And in this way also, it will allow me to place myself in contrast with like those two main poles that I mentioned in the literature, like offensive realism and power transition theory, but also to distinguish myself from some works that we have where we have geography. Like I don't know if you know the work of Vasquez and Senese, let's call it the steps of war model, and geography plays a role, but they also have like an important component, a unit level variable. They don't frame in terms of ideology of fascism, but like it's the willingness, the tendency to use like realpolitik, like aggressive measures, which is based on domestic politics. And there are like other explanations. Even Copeland actually mentioned that war initiation eventually has like a unit level variable in it, so the role of leaders. But in terms of my theory, it's pretty structural. Ideological explanations, according to me, can be important in one specific case study, but like they're not sufficient to be included like in elegant theories that will add more of what we can with a structural one.
Thanks. Let's go now to a question from Theodoras Sukas, who's a PhD candidate at Vilnius University in Lithuania. It says, thank you for your presentation. How would you evaluate historiographic attitudes on the origins of World War I raised since the end of the Cold War that see World War I as an improbable war. World War I is the fruit of the July crisis and a great number of misunderstandings and miscalculations. This perspective asserts that no power in 1914 wanted a general confrontation. Would this kind of approach be in opposition to your theoretical proposition in explaining the origins of World War I?
Yes, it would be in opposition. And when I mentioned the four main, of course, there are buckets of theories, like there are countless theories in World War I. But like the number four is in a Brenner war thesis, that's the case. The idea is that the military took over the civilians, like on the eve like of the war. The chancellor did not want to go to war. It was led to that through like the mobilization mechanism that could not be prevented. But like they knew, I would say like one. I think like that's the most likely explanation. Like it's clear that they knew, not just Germany knew. Russia knew that by leading to what I call like first like secret mobilization, then like partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary, then increasing measure per war, like the issuing general mobilization. There are like elements. I think that most of them also in the paper when I address alternative explanations. They knew they would trigger a continental war at least. So they knew that. And actually, if you're interested, I push you to read like there is a really interesting article by Art Snyder, I think it's called 1914, everyone's favorite year for war, something like that. Because like the idea is that like people also like Fisher thesis, like the idea is that Germany wanted war, right? But like in that case, like we show that France wanted war in 1914 because it was the best moment for having like Russia to step in and attack Germany. Russia wanted war in 1914 because like they were concerned like Germany would become too much powerful in the future. Perhaps Great Britain did not want war, but like it seemed that like leaders were really keen to war. One can make the case against me and against structural theories that it was because of other explanations, like the Carthage offensive and other like domestic variables. But like I think in terms of like being a burden, like the evidence clearly not, but like according to my opinion, like clearly like leaves out the explanation.
Thanks. It's a question, it sort of builds off of Melissa Carlson and Ethan Lee's question about the impact of technology. And they, Melissa asks, advances in weapons technologies have changed how great powers perceive encirclement and adversaries' operational capabilities. Have they affected the importance of geographic proximity for, mounting a successful invasion as it did in World War I? And if your answer is no, I mean, are there technologies that would fall into that category that would so alter operational capabilities of adversaries so as to trigger this encirclement mechanism? That latter part is my add-on.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, of course, they have an impact. So like it's different from like waging war with horses, or like with tanks, or like with like even technologies we now aware of. The idea is that, but that changed like the quickness, right? So for instance, that is the ability of like moving like troops, like with railroads more quickly than before, for instance. But like it doesn't change the kind of framework that lead to war initiation. And like the current technology might change the speed in which decisions are made, might even like increase like the intensity of the what I call double security dilemma, right? But like I don't think like it changes much like the decision of war initiation, because eventually, in terms of like great power war, a systemic war that involves all the great power, that involves territorial invasion, territorial gains by your opponent. And in order to have that, I don't see a technology that will change the kind of like observations that we had in the past, in terms of like quality, not quantity, of course. But that's like there can be a way in which technology plays a role. I don't dispute that, but like I think that doesn't. The thing is that they are not exceptional to revolutionize what we saw in the past. So it's like the debate: did nuclear weapons revolutionize like international politics? Is it different from before? My answer to that is no, and for the same reason, I would answer no to new like technology changing the way great power wars, major wars will occur.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to go to back to Jill Hazelton at Naval War College. And she says, it sounds like you're providing a paradigm shift from major wars or world wars being the product of hegemonic competition to one in which these are the product of defensive preventive wars based on a perceived window of opportunity. She says she likes this, but how does this differ from Christensen and Snyder on World War One?
Well, that's like, if that's reference like of the article like chain ganging and backpassing, I don't know if that's reference. I mean, that's like the explanation for, I mean, the article is based on polarity and like, if I'm not wrong, like perception, like as the two main variables. Correct me if I recall wrong, but like that's more like for one step. First, like it's analysis of one case study, the recent and overarching theory on major wars. I think it's not like the same target. I don't see like I don't see them as the main level of comparison. I think that we are talking about two different like outcomes of observation. I'm not saying they are wrong. Indeed, like so when we talk about chain gang, like is being dragged into a conflict is part of my explanation. Like it's chain gang, like it's, of course, like that's part of it. But I think like there are two different levels. But I think again, like the importance is again, it's not like about one state dominating. Like I agree, like we will say, like it's defensive, right? I wouldn't use preventive war because I think it's I'm a little bit like wary of like the way in which preemptive preventive are kind of like addressed in literature, and I addressed that in my book manuscript. But it would definitely like be for defensive reasons, right? And like the best example, according to me, is the September program, World War One. So for all those that think Germany wanted war all the way along, it's really like crazy, I would say, not to see a war plan before the war. So Germany created a war plan after the war began. So September 14th, I think, or 1914. And if you look at the bullet points of the main parts, they're actually to create a wedge between Russia and Germany and to like create a wedge with France on the west to break encirclement. So there is no like, it's like, and with actually the Brest-Litov Pact is part of it, right? It's to create this corridor of states to slow down the mobilization and then like the advances of Russia. So I think that the idea is that, yes, it's for defensive reason to break the two-front war problem.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. So please join me in thanking Dr. Bartoletti for a great talk. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully, you're on our mailing list, and stay tuned for this same space and time next week.